point out that the sun shines down its power to all the world and makes the wind blow strong as it will. I wonder how gentle rains can fall upon the land, so lovely earth can stay lovely still. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 498th edition of Energy Week with George Harvey and Tom Fennell. Tom is unfortunately not here today. We have a series of technical issues. And by the way, one thing that would help would be if we could get a ride for Tom to come to the studio. Unfortunately, he's been not able to get around very much, but he could come in if we had a ride with somebody. Both to the studio and home, which would be things that would be separated by about an hour and a half. Okay, we are starting today with the 10th of November, news on the 10th of November, today being the 17th of November. And we are starting, I should say, this is all material that comes from my blog, geoharvey.com. You can go to the blog and click on the date of the article, or you can go to a different blog, which is listed lower on the screen if you're watching this on a computer, or you can download a file that's there. Either of those sources has got links to the original articles. We're starting with an article from KCCU on Thursday, November 10th, today being the 17th. This is a week ago. And this article is titled, "Investors Have Trillions to Fight Climate Change. Developing Nations Get Little of It." Many investors see big opportunities to propel and profit from the fight against climate change. Yet little of their money is going to poorer nations, which already bear the brunt of extreme weather, despite contributing little to the pollution that fuels climate change. And basically, that tells you a lot right there, just that statement. Most of actually, if you get down to it, almost all of the greenhouse gases come from developed countries. Countries that have people who drive cars, countries that have people who fly around in airplanes, countries with a lot of heat and a lot of industry and a lot of pollution from a lot of sources. Poor countries don't have those things, and they contribute very little to climate change, but they do suffer. And in some cases, the poorer countries are going to disappear because, for example, some of them are island countries, and with sea rising, within a few decades, their islands will be uninhabitable. And if anybody wonders about that, anybody who does wonder about it should take a look at the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, where people in some of the coastal areas in Louisiana, for example, have been told they're going to have to leave their homes within not very many years, within, say, 3 decades, because the area of their homes is going to be inundated with water. And Cameron Parish, Louisiana, which is a county-sized area, is almost everybody in Cameron Parish is going to have to leave, because Cameron Parish is actually sinking slightly and the sea level is rising. And between those two things, there's not a lot of future for that area, which is the size of a county. Other areas in Louisiana have the same problem. Other areas in Florida have the same problem. The problem is not going to go away. I want to put up the picture that goes with this story. This is a picture that I chose. It's just a picture of wind turbines, but there it is. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next story, And I will go on to the next picture as well. This picture is a picture of oil rigs in the twilight. These oil rigs are not operating rigs out at sea. This is in an area, I believe it's in Scotland, where old rigs go when their lifetime is done, and they just sit there in an area where there's old oil rigs. This story is from the BBC. The title is Sharp Rise in Fossil Fuel Industry Delegates at the COP27 Climate Summit. The COP27 Climate Summit has been going on, as I am speaking now, it's been going on for several days. It will end tomorrow, which is the 18th of November. And the Climate Summit is happening in Egypt. And let me read the synopsis. The number of delegates with links to fossil fuels at the UN Climate Summit has jumped 25% from the last meeting. Now, the last meeting was COP26, which was 1 year ago. Analysis shared by the BBC shows this. Campaign group Global Witness found more than 600 people at the talks in Egypt are linked to fossil fuels. Again, what we've got here is a bunch of countries that are in trouble, a bunch of delegates from wealthy countries and the countries that produce fossil fuels who, because of financial reasons usually, want to maintain the status quo. And we'll see how it all comes to an end. There has been some progress made. There has been some progress made in relations between the United States and China. But really, these smaller countries that are having trouble are in trouble, and we'll just have to see if there's anything that anybody gives them to help out of this, because this has been difficult for them. Okay, the next item that we have here is this is a picture of an H2 Pro electrolyzer. The article is from Renews. Its title is Israeli Green Hydrogen Firm Picks Up Moroccan Job. Gaia, a Moroccan renewable energy developer, will use electrolyzer technology from Israeli company H2 Pro, and it's the H2 Pro electrolyzer that you're seeing here, for a green hydrogen demo project in Morocco. The announcement came at COP27, where the topic of green hydrogen and its role in net zero transition is much discussed. Green hydrogen it's an interesting thing. Hydrogen, if you burn it, burns just sort of like natural gas does. It's not the same amount of energy. You would need to treat it differently. There are differences that are important. You can't just feed pure hydrogen into a natural gas line and expect a person's stove to behave normally, or anything else that a person has that runs on natural gas. Nevertheless, green hydrogen can be used for some important things. And the interesting thing about green hydrogen is big companies and, in fact, countries are investing tens of billions of dollars in green hydrogen. And so far, there's practically no market for the green hydrogen. So they're producing something which is going to market without buyers. And that I find very strange. Nevertheless, as the hydrogen is starting to appear, organizations are coming forward that do want to buy it. And now we have, I think it's 14 trains in Germany that are being run on hydrogen using hydrogen fuel cells. And so things are changing on that front. Okay, we're up to Friday, November 11th. I have a picture of a wind turbine. This particular wind turbine is in Egypt, and obviously a tour group of some kind is taking a look at it. The article is from Energy Digital magazine, and the title is 10 gigawatt wind farm to be built in Egypt. And the synopsis says Masdar, Infinity Power, and Hassan Alam Utilities have signed an agreement to develop a 10 gigawatt onshore wind project in Egypt, one of the world's largest wind farms. The project will reduce Egypt's carbon emissions by 9% and save the country an estimated $5 billion each year. Now, what they're saving, of course, is $5 billion in fuel costs and in the costs of operating fuel-burning facilities instead of wind farm. This will be one of the biggest wind farms in the world, but it I don't know that it's going to be the biggest. 10 gigawatt wind farms are coming along. That size is no longer as surprising as it would have been 5 years ago. A 10 gigawatt onshore wind farm, by the way, is, I would say in a country like Egypt, it's probably going to be the equivalent of perhaps as many as 3, certainly more than 2 large nuclear power plants. There is a thing called a capacity factor, which is what part of the time is the facility operating at what wattage, and times it's what part of the time is the facility operating at what output. And for different power sources, it's different. And for wind power, it might be 30%, it might be 35%, in which case this would be 3 or 3.5 gigawatts of power, which is the equivalent of 3 large nuclear power plants. It would be the equivalent of perhaps 5 plants the size of the old Vermont Yankee plant. And of course, this is something that they're talking about doing in Egypt. So, the next article here is from Clean Technica, and I'm going to put this picture up. The title of the article is Argonne and Oak Ridge National Laboratories collaborate with Wabtec on hydrogen-powered trains. And that, I believe, is, well, it's a Wabtec train for sure, and I believe it is hydrogen-powered. Scientists at the Argonne and Oak Ridge National Laboratories are exploring options for emissions-free trains. The research focuses on hydrogen and other low-carbon fuels as viable technologies to diesel, alternative technologies to diesel for the rail industry. And basically what's happening here is diesel locomotives are noisy and polluting. And this makes me think of when I lived in New Hampshire on a mountaintop. There was a stretch of about 3.5 miles of train track that was aimed exactly at my window. And I was about 600 feet higher than the track. So as the train was coming at 2 o'clock in the morning, its headlight would shine through my window. Now, the headlight started shining through my window when the train was 7 miles away, and stopped when it went around a slight bend when it was 3.5 miles away. And I timed the amount of time that it took for that to happen, so that from the time it came on till the time it went off. And that was, as I recall, it was about 10 minutes. But I could hear the train 10 minutes before I could see it, which meant that the train, when I first heard it, was about 10 miles away. And you know, these trains are polluting. They could be replaced by fuel cells using hydrogen, and the pollution would be gone, the noise would be gone. And it would be an entirely different kind of operation, much more comfortable for a person who wants to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. When that train went by, it would wake me up before it appeared, and I could hear that train for 2 hours because it went into a switching place and it switched, backed up, switched again, and went off. It was, as I said, sometimes it was 2 hours. Okay, the next story is from CNN. I'm going to put up this picture. This is just a picture of a wave. I got this at Pexels, which means that it didn't come with the story. Floridians are picking up the pieces after Hurricane Nicole pummeled the state, killing at least 4 and collapsing homes as it moved north. Now, this is the first of 2 stories we're going to have about this. Let me read the synopsis. Nicole hit Florida's coast as a Category 1 hurricane, just as the state was still reeling from the catastrophic Hurricane Ian. Nicole was the first hurricane to hit the United States during November in nearly 40 years. So, as I said, we will get back to that. There was a lot of damage that was done by Nicole, and when we get back to this story, I will go into that in more detail. The next story is from Saturday, November 12th, and we have a picture here of a Tesla Model Y. This is from Clean Technica. The title is, Tesla Model Y dominated European car sales in September. Automotive market intelligence company JATO posted the results of the September 2022 car sales data for Europe. The data show that in September, the Tesla Model Y topped the sales chart for all cars for the first time since it was launched in Europe in August of 2021. Now, this is a car that has been for sale in Europe for a year, a little over a year, and it became the biggest selling car in Europe. This is not the biggest selling electric car in Europe. It is the biggest selling car in Europe of all kinds. So it's outselling any car from Ford or GM. That's not surprising, but it's outselling cars from Honda and more importantly from Volkswagen. So that is surprising. The Tesla Model Y rather, is a car that the Europeans can appreciate, and they've taken to it in large numbers. Okay. Our next story is we're returning to the storm, and we are going back to CNN. And in this story, the title is Florida Picks Up. Let me put this up. There we go. Florida picks up after Nicole kills at least 5 and leaves unprecedented damage to the Daytona area coastline. Now, this picture is a picture taken in Florida after Hurricane Ian, which was a much more powerful hurricane. And people were still recovering from Ian when Nicole hit. Well, let me read the synopsis here. As Nicole moved north, Floridians were picking up the pieces. It killed at least 5 people and ripped apart buildings with its dangerous storm surge and powerful winds. Many were still recovering from Hurricane Ian when Nicole hit. And part of the problem here was that when Nicole hit, it was a high tide when it hit. It was a king tide when it hit. I hope I'm getting this right and I'm not telling you about Ian. Ian was a much more powerful storm. But Nicole had the sea level was already raised quite a lot by the fact that it was a high tide and it was a king tide, which means that it was the highest tide period in the month. And the result of that was that there was a lot of water undermining the foundations of coastal houses, and houses were just being washed into the sea. So this has been a very big problem for Florida. And one thing that I should mention here is, in Florida, we now have what is called sunny day flooding. What you're seeing there is not sunny day flooding. This is flooding that happened, and clearly you can see from the shadows that the sun is shining, but this happened because of a storm. Sunny day flooding is not because of a storm. It's what happens when the tide is high and the infrastructure that's used for draining the sewers and so forth is old enough that it can't compensate or address the fact that the high tides are higher by several inches than they used to be. They are higher by several inches than they were, and you could count on them being, for a normal high tide. And the result of that is that in Florida, there are places where there is flooding, and there's no storm, there's no rainfall. It just floods because the sewers back up, the storm sewers back up, and the water just rises up out of the manholes. And the reason for that is because the sea level has risen by a couple of inches, and they have to redesign things. And there are places near Miami where in fact, I think Miami is actually putting $500 million into putting in check valves in the sewer systems and trying to address the fact that the roads are flooding, raising the roads, making the roads a foot or 18 inches higher than they used to be. This is something that they're doing to address the damage that's being done by tides, not because of storms, but just because the sea level has gone up. If somebody tells you that the sea level is going to raise 1/8 of an inch in 300 years, which is something that somebody quoted very recently, that person really doesn't understand. And you know, the military in the United States has been trying to get people to understand for years about the fact that they're having problems because docks are lower to the water than they were when they were designed to be for use. And the result of that is naval vessels at some point, at some of the time, don't line up with them properly. Okay, our next picture is a graphic that is supposed to represent what happens when AI tracks emissions. This is from Clean Technica. Pardon me. First global estimates for road transportation GHG leveraging AI and satellite images. Okay, that doesn't sound very understandable, does it? Scientists at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Laurel, Maryland, have leveraged artificial intelligence and machine learning to produce accurate estimates for road transportation emissions of the top 500 emitting cities worldwide. That kind of explains the title. Let me read the title again. First global estimates for road transportation, greenhouse gas leveraging AI and satellite images. So they're looking at material that comes from artificial intelligence and machine learning based on satellite images to see where the emissions are happening. This is something that I think will probably be useful at some point. Okay, we're up to Sunday, the 13th of November, and we have a picture here of a place in Alaska. This is from CNN. The title is Belching Lakes, Mystery Craters, Zombie Fires, How the Climate Crisis is Transforming the Permafrost. Nunapitchuk, Alaska, used to be in the middle of the grassy tundra. This is a picture from Nunapitchuk, Alaska. Now it sits in bogland. People who used to walk on grass now use 8-foot wide boardwalks to get around. And you can notice from this that the 8-foot wide boardwalk, which was recently installed, collapsed. The Arctic is warming fast, and that brings many unexpected problems. In this particular village, and there are other pictures of this particular village, the entire village, which used to be tundra, is now bogland, and that's not a joke. That's you can't get around the village because there's no place to walk, and you know, the whole thing is sinking. Now in this picture, the right-hand side of that building is a little bit lower than the left-hand side, and if you have a good eye for angles, you can see that the tank that is off the right side of the building is down on its left side compared to its right side. So that area, the right side of the building and the left side of the tank, is down. That building is tipping. The tank is tipping. In some cases, buildings are literally unlivable because they have tipped so much that you just couldn't live in that building. This one was built, as you can see, there's a structure under it that is designed to be supported by the permafrost, and it isn't supported by the permafrost anymore. So that's a problem. Okay, our next picture is a heat pump water heater, and this article is from Clean Technica. The title is Millions of U.S. Homes Are Installing Heat Pumps. Will it be enough? Across the United States, over 15 states and roughly 100 cities have begun to shift policies to encourage or even require electrification of homes, workplaces, schools, and government buildings. Nevertheless, we are falling woefully short on climate pledges. We have to do better. I should explain this particular picture. You can see that there's a water heater just to the right of the middle of the picture, that vertical cylinder. And that water heater is operated by heat pump. So instead of having resistance electric pieces in it that heat it up, it's got a heat pump which is remote from it. And that is an inexpensive way to run a water heater. Heat pumps are less expensive than almost any other source of heat for a home, for general heating, and they're used a lot for other things too. And anybody who wonders about heat pumps, I will point out to you that you're very much accustomed to them. You just might not know it. An air conditioner is a heat pump. A refrigerator has a heat pump in it. In the case of an air conditioner, the air conditioner is taking the heat in a hot building and it is pushing it out into the even hotter outdoors. And if anybody really wants an explanation for that, I could probably give it to you, but it's not really necessary. It's just that the air conditioner is taking the heat out of the building that is cooler than the outdoors, and it is pushing it into the much hotter outdoors. The heat pump operating a water heater would work the same way. And by the way, the heat pump operating the water heater has got an area that gets cold, and that area is an area. It is a unit that actually will capture water out of the air. It really is not a way to dehumidify your basement, but it can help. And since the heat pump is a lot cheaper than other kinds of units. This is a big deal. The first time I wrote about heat pumps for Green Energy Times, the heat pump was about as expensive to run as cordwood. And if you're building a house, I can tell you that a heat pump powered by electricity in a building that has been built for it is cheaper to build, and it's cheaper to run than a wood-burning stove of any kind in a house that has a chimney, because the chimney is going to cost more than the heat pump, very likely. Okay, let's move on here. We have an item from the BBC. This is a gas flare, and the title here is "Uncovering the Dirty Secret Behind BP's Bumper Profits." Far removed from the world leaders making climate pledges at COP27 are people like Ali Hussein Jaloud, a young leukemia survivor living on an Iraqi oil field co-managed by BP. When the BBC discovered BP was not declaring the field's gas flaring, Ali helped us reveal the truth. Now, what you find in this article is that BP, which stands for British Petroleum, is running an oil field in Iraq, and they're flaring the gas, which means instead of trapping it and selling it, they're just burning it, which is something that oil companies and gas companies do. But in this particular case, BP is not declaring that that's what they're doing. It's probably inconvenient for them to do so. They might have to pay taxes. It might be counted as a greenhouse gas they're emitting. They don't want they don't want problems. The reason they're flaring this is is very likely, I should say, because what they're after is oil. They don't get enough gas out of the wells to make it worthwhile to trap it and sell it, or possibly the gas coming out of the wells is not of sufficiently high quality. It might have other gases mixed with it, which would mean that you'd have to separate them. You'd have to do chemical processing on them in order to be able to sell the gas as natural gas. And that is expensive. So anyway, BBC went and investigated BP, and they found things that they didn't like. Okay, we're up to Monday, the 14th of November, and we have a picture of wind turbines. These are floating wind turbines. Floating wind turbines is a fairly new technology. And this article is from Renews. Renews has two kinds of articles, one of which is subscriber only, but the ones that I put up are articles that are basically free. So you can read them. They're not long. Generally speaking, they're very short. And the title of this one is "High Wind Tampan Floating Wind Farm Delivers First Power." When these wind farms are put up, wind farms, regardless of whether they're at sea or on land, they start with a first wind turbine. And when that wind turbine is running, they might as well just connect it to the power grid and sell the electricity. So the wind farm starts early in the process with the first turbine, and then as more and more turbines are added, the wind farm produces more and more electricity. The hybrid Tampan floating wind farm in the North Sea has begun producing power from its first turbine. Owned by partners developing the Gullfaks and Snorre wind fields, the high wind Tampan wind farm is expected to meet about 35% of the electricity demand of the two oil fields. So the purpose of this wind farm is not to produce electricity for the grid. The purpose of this wind farm is to produce electricity for offshore oil rigs. And we don't know what that rig in the background is. It might be an offshore oil rig, or it might be another kind of floating utility. for the wind farm or for something else. But this particular wind farm is happening because of these oil rigs. And what is going on here is that and this is the thing that's interesting about this, the electricity that's needed for this is to support the extraction of fossil fuels. And we see this over and over again, where coal mines are putting up solar arrays to provide them with electricity to cut their costs. Other types of fossil fuels operations are putting up wind. Here, in this example, it's wind. Wind farms, floating wind farms have to go, when the continental shelf is, when you're beyond the continental shelf, when the bottom of the sea is too far down, the wind turbines have to be floating. So these are not the kind of thing that was being made years and years ago. Okay, our next item is from Renew Economy. We have a picture of a solar array. Let me put that up. This is Forest unveils 10 gigawatt renewable super hub to power grid and green hydrogen. That's the title. Now, Forrest in this case is the man who is a man who is the CEO of an organization called Fortescue, and I will read the synopsis. Queensland's push to be a hydrogen superpower gained serious momentum with the announcement of a renewable energy supergrid that will host more than 10 gigawatts of wind and solar projects to produce green hydrogen at an industrial scale. Queensland, in case you don't know, is a state in Australia. Fortescue is a big company, and Forrest, I think it's Andrew Forrest, I might have that wrong, has been pursuing renewable energy for some time because it is inexpensive and he can use it in these remote places. And this is one of the biggest things behind renewable energy in Australia. That is from Renew Economy, by the way. Okay, the next item on the list here is from Clean Technica. It is titled, Fossil Vehicle Bans Are Likely to Hit Mom and Pop Gas Stations the Hardest. The California Air Resources Board's decision to phase out fossil fuel-powered cars by 2035 was an important step to address air quality and climate change. There will be winners and losers, and the mom and pop gas station owners seem to be among the losers. And they go through the lists of why this is happening. Basically, there are a lot of reasons why mom and pop organizations are not going to survive as well, but nevertheless, this is the thing that they say. Personally, I think we're going to get to a point where people stop off wherever they feel like it to recharge their cars. And the places where they recharge the cars will not be convenience stores. What they are more likely to be is restaurants, because recharging the car takes a little bit longer. But I mean, the ma and pa store is according to this article, going to suffer. Okay, we're up to Tuesday, November 15th. We have another article from Clean Technica. This particular picture is, and I apologize because it's probably fuzzy. This is the highest quality picture I could get of this particular image, which is referenced in the article. Hydrogen House deploys rooftop solar panels, but don't call them solar panels. Okay, the idea of a house that can produce its own hydrogen has been tossed around for a while now. We might expect solar panels to be involved, but Belgian researchers mapped out a different pathway. Their panels generate hydrogen gas instead of electricity. So what they're doing here is they have solar panels on the roof that don't produce electricity at all. The normal way that you would get from solar to electricity would be to have solar panels produce electricity. The electricity is going to an electrolyzer, which is breaking up water into oxygen and hydrogen. Usually when this is done, the oxygen is released, although it can be trapped and sold, and the thing that you want out of it is the hydrogen. In this case, the panels on the roof, I'm going to put that picture back up. The lower bank of panels on that roof, which is darker than the upper bank, that lower bank is hydrogen panels. They produce hydrogen. And they produce that hydrogen out of water that is in the air. So you don't have to feed water to these things. And since the water in the air is pretty pure, you're not going to have a lot of attention going into keeping these things clean. But you will have a tank in the back, right there, that holds the hydrogen you produce, and then you can use the hydrogen for whatever you're going to use it for, which could be cooking in your stove instead of natural gas. Okay, our next item is from CNN, and this is, let me put this up. They had a very nice picture of macaws in a rainforest, of a macaw in a rainforest. It was a tiny macaw in a big rainforest. I decided, because it was copyrighted, that I would put this up. This is from Unsplash, which is a place that you can go to for free images. Not all images there are free, but you can get free images. And the title of this is Biggest Rainforest Nations Form Triple Alliance to Save Jungle. The world's three largest rainforest nations, and those are Brazil, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Indonesia, have launched a partnership to cooperate on forest preservation after a decade of on-off talks on a trilateral alliance. They will pressure the rich countries in the world to finance forest conservation. And that basically tells you the story of what that is all about. Brazil is probably going to do better under the president-elect, a man they call Lulu, than it has done of late under President Bolsonaro, who is called what do they call him? The Trump of Latin America, something like that. Okay. Our next item is also from CNN, and the title of this article is As Rich Nations Haggle Over Climate Solutions, the storm-ravaged Caribbean is taking matters into its own hands. The Caribbean leaders, residents, and even utility companies say they are tired of waiting for world leaders to save them. Let me put this picture up. This is a set of solar arrays that are being used in a location, and my recollection is that is in Puerto Rico. I might be mistaken about that. Experts and residents tell CNN that the islands are now eagerly phasing out fossil fuels and building microgrids. These nations and areas like Puerto Rico, which is a territory, lose a lot of money every year by buying fuel in order to keep diesel generators running, or buying coal to keep coal power plants running. And then they get hit by a hurricane, which takes down everything. And then in some cases, it might take a year to get everything back to normal again, just in time for the next hurricane in some cases. If they have microgrids, they can recover faster. And a microgrid built around this kind of image, where you have these solar arrays, If a hurricane came along and ripped those solar arrays badly, it would not knock them out altogether. Hurricane Andrew hit solar arrays and damaged them, but only damaged 2% in some cases, in many cases, at most, of the panels in the array. So these microgrids can survive where a more, excuse me, where a more 20th century kind of system, which would depend upon fossil fuel burning generators. Pardon me. These arrays can last much better. And so they just keep going. You might have to take a panel off, reconnect some wires. I hope I don't keep going with that. Sometimes I'll sneeze 6 or 8 or 10 times in a row. It's because my sinuses are draining and they irritate my nose. Okay, I'm going to go on. We are up to Wednesday, the 16th of November, and we have an article here from NRDC, which is the Natural Resources Defense Coalition. Okay, that's a guess. Getting Renewable Energy Connected, that's the title. There are about, this particular article was one that I found stunning. I'm going to put this picture up so you can see it. The picture really, it's one I found to go with the article. There are about 1,300 gigawatts of new energy resources, primarily renewables and storage, waiting to connect to power grids across the United States. This is just in the United States. This is the equivalent of maybe 300 large nuclear reactors. That's more than the combined output of all of the power plants operating in the country today. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission blames that backlog on old rules. Now, I should explain something here. Earlier, I referenced the capacity factor. Each type of energy has got a different capacity factor. The capacity factor for solar is fairly low. It might be 15%. So if you have a capacity 100 megawatt solar array, you might expect that at any given moment, on average, it's going to be outputting about 15 megawatts out of 100. But that's because half the time it's night and it's outputting nothing. And then during the daytime, it's going to output varying amount of time, varying amounts of electricity depending upon the weather conditions. It's going to output less on a cloudy day than on a sunny day, less on a rainy day than on a sunny day. And if it has just snowed, it might output practically nothing. But nevertheless, and wind power, onshore wind power, you're talking about 35% capacity factor. For nuclear, it's usually around 90% in the United States, or a little higher. For natural gas, it might be 60% or higher, depending upon the kind of natural gas plant. In some natural gas plants, it's below 10%, but there are special reasons for that. At any rate, renewables in general, you can look at them and say, okay, let's say that it's 20%. Here we've got 1,300 gigawatts, and at 20%, that would be 260 gigawatts basically all the time. For an average output during the year. 260 gigawatts is about 260 large nuclear power plants. And another thing that I should mention is that if you have batteries that are big enough with solar power or wind power or both, you can have what is called near firm capacity from a solar farm or a wind farm or a combined farm. And that near farm firm capacity is able to be dispatched. And you can get energy from it at any time, just like you can from a nuclear power plant, but it has some advantages over nuclear. A nuclear power plant cannot operate by itself. It has to have other plants operating to assist it. Load following plants, which are more expensive. Peaker plants, which are very much more expensive. And there's other kinds of plants that back up nuclear power. When you have a near firm solar or wind power, that actually can operate by itself. And when that happens, if the load changes, if the demand changes, you can address that change instantly. You can address it so fast that a person at home, if he had equipment to see how much power was available on the grid, would not see that you have changed the output, power output. Where in the older things, it might take 10 minutes for things to balance out. So they would speed things up and slow things down, and people's clocks would be off very slightly. It was all part of a big game kind of people they would play to keep the power kind of in line. Okay, I'm going to go on here. Our next item is from the BBC. The title of this is "Small Firms Have a Big Role Fighting Climate Change." This picture is a picture of the main street in Logan, Utah. And the reason I used that picture, I think it's a good picture for this. I looked up mom and pop stores, and this is one of the pictures that showed up. And I thought, yeah, why not? That looks like mom and pop stores, doesn't it? This is from the BBC. In the United States, small businesses make up 99% of companies. They employ nearly half of the American workforce, but their sheer numbers make it tough to regulate them. Focusing on supply chains can make it easier to engage with small businesses, unlocking billions in emissions savings. And you know, why is it hard to regulate these companies? Well, a lot of the regulations that you see coming out of Washington, D.C., for example, the regulations only apply to companies if they have more than a certain number of employees. That's one way of doing things. If you have, and that is something that has been used to be counterproductive for various kinds of things. I know of one case where a person objected to a regulation that applied to companies with more than 20 employees. And he didn't like it, but he had 21 employees. And if he fired one of them, then he was no longer regulated. So he did. He fired somebody in order to avoid the regulation. That kind of thing happens. But in fact, there are a lot of problems with trying to regulate small businesses. If we have, according to this article, there are ways to deal with these companies that will engage them in dealing with climate change that don't require them to be regulated. So that is something kind of worth noting. I'm going to put that picture up again. I think that's kind of a pleasant picture. Okay, our last story for today is coming from E&E News. And let me put this picture up. This is a picture of a landscape in Bali. Bali, of course, is an island in Indonesia. And the title of this article is "Wealthy Nations Inc. $20 billion deal to move Indonesia off coal." You know, I'm tired of articles that use the word "inc" to mean sign. I don't know, there are word usages that just bother me. one of my pet peeves is when people say utilize when they really mean use. And they've done it so much now that the dictionaries even say that utilize can mean use. But if you look at the way the word is built, it doesn't mean use, it means make useful. Anyway, I'm being dumb here, I'm sorry. A group of wealthy countries secured an agreement with Indonesia to shift the major emitters' power generation from coal to clean energy. The $20 billion deal is financed by financial institutions and governments. It would be one of the largest public investments to close fossil fuel plants. Indonesia is a country that has, it's a country that uses a lot of coal. It's also a country that is an oil producer. And in fact, that combination was one of the reasons why Japan attacked the United States during at the beginning of the Second World War. They wanted to be able to get to Indonesia. They wanted to be able to take over Indonesia and take over the oil and coal in Indonesia for their own purposes. But in order to make use of it, they had to go buy the Philippines. And the Philippines were under the control of the United States. So they had to attack the Philippines in order to secure their sea lanes to Indonesia. And in order to do that, they had to stop the American fleet in Hawaii from getting involved. So basically what I'm saying here is, from a Japanese point of view, much of the reason for getting into a war with the United States was because of energy. And it's the same thing today. You know, countries are fighting over energy. In this particular case, Indonesia has coal, and it is building today coal-burning power plants. As backward as that might seem, that's what they're doing. And in the United States, we haven't built any coal-burning power plants for quite a while, and in fact, we're closing them down early. But Indonesia needs the electricity, and Indonesia has the resources, and Indonesia doesn't have the financial resources to build renewable energy. So these countries and various financial institutions are getting involved. Not necessarily from a purely philanthropic point of view. Financial institutions might get involved in a thing like this with the idea of making money down the road. Nevertheless, they have struck a deal, and that deal might be repeated elsewhere. So we're up to the end of the story, end of the week. My advice to you is have a justifiably jolly week. I think that's good. And if Tom were here, and hopefully next week he will be, he would say, y'all come back next time, you hear? I don't know that I got that right. Anyway, have a good week. Bye.